The title of Duke of Rothesay and the other Scottish titles which I've had the honour to carry for so long, I now pass to Catherine.
There is a document inside Buckingham Palace that very few people have been permitted to read. It carries the king's signature, a royal seal, and language so precise that constitutional advisors spent weeks refining every sentence. And when Charles finally placed his pen down after signing it, the people standing in that room did not celebrate. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that what had just happened would change the shape of the British monarchy for generations. But before the full weight of that moment can be understood, it is necessary to go back to the beginning. Because this document did not appear suddenly. It was the result of months of tension, a single confrontation inside Windsor Castle, and a series of private conversations that the palace had gone to considerable lengths to keep out of the public record. King Charles III had been watching the dynamics inside his own household shift for some time. Since his accession, the question of how authority would eventually move into the next reign had never been far from his advisors' minds. Transition planning, the careful, largely invisible process of preparing royal duties and responsibilities for the next monarch, is among the most sensitive work the palace undertakes. It touches on staff loyalty, public trust, ceremonial influence, and the delicate balance of personalities that a functioning royal household requires. What made the situation in Charles's case more complicated than any purely procedural challenge was that it involved three people he loved, and a conflict he had hoped, for a very long time, he might be able to avoid. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had spent more than a decade building something that is genuinely difficult to manufacture inside any institution: public trust earned through consistency. She had not sought influence through proximity to power or through political maneuvering. She had earned it through restraint, through discipline, through showing up during the most difficult periods of the monarchy's recent history with composure that even her critics found hard to dismiss. By the time Charles began working seriously on the continuity framework, the confidential document defining how royal authority, ceremonial leadership, and household control would pass into William's future reign, Catherine's standing, both inside the palace and among the wider public, had become one of the institution's most significant assets. Commonwealth consultations pointed to her. Household assessments described her. Public confidence data confirmed her. The question was no longer whether she would be central to what came next. The question was what that centrality would mean for the woman who already stood beside the current king. Camilla, Queen Consort, had arrived at this chapter of her life after a journey that had cost her, and those around her, a great deal. The controversy that surrounded her relationship with Charles, the years of public hostility, the gradual and hard-fought shift toward acceptance, none of that had been simple or painless. What she had earned through those years, or believed she had earned, was a place not merely in the present reign, but in the one that followed it. Her household, her advisors, her circle of trusted allies, these were not simply personal comforts. They represented what she understood to be her continuing relevance inside the institution she had sacrificed so much to serve. And for a long time, there was no formal reason to believe that relevance was under threat. Then came Windsor. The Commonwealth reception planning meeting had been called to coordinate arrangements for a major forthcoming event. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was expected to chair the Future Strategy Committee. It was not a surprising assignment. Her role in public engagement, youth outreach, and patronage reform had been growing steadily, and palace officials had come to rely on her in those areas with increasing confidence. But when the meeting convened, with King Charles and Prince William, the Prince of Wales, both present, the Queen Consort objected. What she said in that room, directly, in front of the future king and his father, was not a quiet expression of concern. It was a direct challenge. There cannot be two queens directing this family while I am still here. Catherine did not argue. She closed her briefing folder, looked toward the monarch, and asked calmly whether her presence had become an obstacle. Charles did not answer immediately. His silence lasted only seconds, but those who were in the room would later say that it struck harder than anything he might have said aloud. Prince William pushed back his chair and made clear that his wife's future authority was not Camilla's to restrict. The king called for calm, but the atmosphere in that room had shifted in a way that no procedural courtesy could undo. What nobody in that meeting fully understood at the time was that those few minutes at Windsor were about to become the foundation of something far larger than any of them had anticipated. Charles, according to the documented record prepared for the succession files, returned that evening and requested the confidential transition papers. He wrote across the Windsor record 4 words: "Continuity requires clarity." Within 48 hours, constitutional advisors had been instructed to begin drafting the instrument that would determine not just how the next reign would begin, but who would be permitted to shape it. And yet, as significant as that decision was, it is what happened after the document was signed that revealed the true cost of what Charles had done. Because the people most affected by it had not yet read it. And when they did, the private reactions inside Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Adelaide Cottage told a story that the official language of the instrument could never fully contain. What Catherine found when she opened the envelope beside William would leave her completely still. What Camilla found inside Clarence House, reading alone, would cause her to push her chair back so sharply it struck the wall. And the sealed annex attached to the decree, the section deliberately withheld from the main text, contained a second set of clauses that neither woman had been told to expect. The full picture of what those pages contained, and what they set in motion, is where the story becomes something that goes far beyond a palace disagreement. It becomes a question about what the monarchy is truly willing to sacrifice in order to secure its own future. The sealed annex was not, as it turned out, a minor procedural addition. Constitutional advisors familiar with the mechanics of royal transition documents later described it as the most operationally significant section of the entire instrument, the part that would determine not simply who held authority in the next reign, but how that authority would actually function in practice. And what made the annex so consequential was not only what it granted Catherine, Princess of Wales, but what it simultaneously dismantled. Under the terms set out in that additional section, the future queen was given formal oversight of strategic planning, charitable patronage, youth engagement policy, and the direction of ceremonial reform as the monarchy moved toward the next reign. These were not honorary designations. They were working responsibilities, the kind of institutional authority that shapes how a royal household actually operates from day to day, how it speaks publicly, how it allocates resources, and how it positions itself in relation to the concerns of a changing country. Royal observers have noted that responsibilities of this scope are rarely codified so explicitly at this stage of a transition. The fact that they were committed to paper at all, with Charles's signature beneath them, suggests that the palace was not merely preparing for an eventual handover. It was, in the assessment of several analysts who have studied royal succession structures, actively accelerating one. The second clause of the annex extended that logic further. It formally blocked members of Camilla's household and her personal network of advisors from carrying influence into the next reign. A clause of this kind is, by any measure, unusual. Royal households are complex organisms, and the individuals who serve within them frequently carry continuity between reigns simply by remaining in post. Senior aides, private secretaries, trusted intermediaries, these are the people who preserve institutional memory and smooth the passage from one era to the next. To formally sever that network before the transition had even begun was, in the words of one constitutional commentator, a decision that went well beyond settling a personal disagreement. It was a structural intervention, and structural interventions of this magnitude do not emerge from a single confrontation at Windsor, however heated that confrontation may have been. Which raises a question that the palace has not addressed directly. How much of what was written into this document had been forming long before that reception planning meeting? Because the evidence, such as it is, points toward a longer and more deliberate process than the official narrative implies. Palace household assessments had been recording tensions between the two royal households for months before Windsor. Staff members had reportedly been receiving conflicting instructions from competing advisory circles. Patronage transfers, the formal reassignments of charitable connections from one royal to another, had, according to internal accounts, been delayed in ways that frustrated Catherine's expanding public program. Some royal watchers have suggested that Windsor was not the cause of the instrument but its occasion, the moment that gave Charles the formal justification to act on conclusions he had already privately reached. If that interpretation is correct, it changes the nature of the decision considerably. It means that what Charles signed was not a reactive measure taken in the aftermath of a difficult confrontation. It was the endpoint of a sustained institutional judgment, one that had been building quietly through documented assessments, private consultations, and recorded household reviews, and that Windsor simply made impossible to delay any further. The king's handwritten notation that evening, "Continuity requires clarity," reads differently under that interpretation. Not as a sudden resolution reached under pressure, but as the final acknowledgement of something he had been moving toward for some time. What is perhaps most revealing about this entire sequence is not the document itself, but the process that produced it. Charles did not move quickly. What Charles consulted was not simply a legal team. The recorded process, leading to the instrument, involved private household reviews, documented staff assessments, formal Commonwealth advisory consultations, and a series of one-on-one conversations that were preserved specifically for the succession files, meaning they were never intended to remain private in the long term. They were intended to become part of the official record of how this transition was managed. That is itself a significant detail. When a sovereign takes the deliberate step of ensuring that private conversations are formally archived, he is not simply making a decision. He is constructing a justification. He is building a documented case for why a decision of this magnitude was not only necessary, but defensible to history, to the institution, and eventually to the public. The question that raises is one that royal analysts have returned to repeatedly. Who was Charles most concerned about persuading? Because the instrument, as written, goes considerably further than the minimum required to settle a dispute over household authority. It does not simply clarify Catherine's future role. It formally structures the next reign's power architecture in ways that would be extraordinarily difficult to reverse without triggering the kind of institutional instability the document was ostensibly designed to prevent. Some royal commentators have pointed out that a sovereign concerned primarily with resolving a personal tension would have achieved that through private instruction and informal arrangement, as previous monarchs have done in comparable situations. The fact that Charles chose instead to create a formal, sealed, multiply-archive constitutional instrument suggests that his concerns extended well beyond the immediate conflict at Windsor, which brings into focus something that has received surprisingly little attention in discussions of the story: the Commonwealth dimension. The consultations that fed into the instrument's drafting were not limited to the palace's internal advisors. Formal discussions with representatives from Commonwealth nations, the voluntary association of countries that the British monarchy continues to serve as a symbolic and ceremonial institution, consistently identified Catherine as essential to the next reign's credibility in those communities. This matters more than it might initially appear, because the Commonwealth relationship has never been more structurally uncertain than it is at this particular moment in the monarchy's history. Several member nations have, in recent years, raised serious questions about the future of their royal ties. The monarchy's ability to remain relevant across those communities depends, in part, on its ability to present a future leadership that those communities can connect with. And the assessments that reached Charles's desk pointed, with unusual consistency, to one person. This introduces a dimension to the instrument that transforms it from a family document into something closer to a foreign policy one. If Catherine's elevation was seen internally not simply as the right outcome for a difficult household dispute, but as a strategic necessity for the monarchy's international standing, then the removal of competing influence from around her becomes less about personal preference and more about institutional clarity. An incoming queen who begins her role with her authority visibly contested, whose decisions are reliably second-guessed by a parallel network of advisors still carrying influence from the previous reign, is a queen whose public credibility is compromised before she has taken a single formal step. Royal observers have noted that this kind of divided authority is not merely uncomfortable, it is historically dangerous for monarchies that depend on the perception of unity to maintain their legitimacy. It is worth pausing on that word, legitimacy, because there is a broader argument embedded within the architecture of this instrument that has not yet been fully examined. Charles III inherited a monarchy navigating one of its most complex periods of public scrutiny. The years preceding his accession had produced departures, disputes, allegations, and a sustained public conversation about the monarchy's relevance that had, at various points, threatened to permanently alter the institution's relationship with large sections of the British public and with audiences far beyond Britain. Against that backdrop, the future reign does not simply need a capable queen. It needs a queen whose public standing is beyond internal challenge, someone whose authority within the household is so clearly established that the institution can present a unified face to a public that has grown increasingly sensitive to signs of dysfunction behind the palace doors. Seen in that light, the instrument is not primarily about Camilla at all. It is about the structural conditions required for William's reign to begin with the kind of authority that the monarchy's current position demands. Camilla's removal from the future governing structure is, in this reading, incidental to a larger design, a consequence of the instrument's purpose rather than its driving motivation. Some analysts have argued that this distinction matters enormously because it changes the moral weight of what Charles did. A king who acted primarily to diminish his wife's future influence is a different figure from a king who acted primarily to secure his son's reign and calculated that the two objectives could not simultaneously be achieved. Whether Charles himself experienced the decision in those terms is something only he and his closest advisors know. What the documented record reveals is that he spent weeks reviewing evidence, consulting widely, and considering alternatives before the instrument was drafted. That process of deliberation does not, on its own, tell us what weighed most heavily on him. But it does suggest that the decision was reached with a degree of care that is difficult to reconcile with the idea of a sovereign acting impulsively or out of personal preference alone. And yet there is one element of the recorded process that sits uncomfortably alongside that narrative of careful institutional reasoning, one detail that has quietly complicated the picture for those who have studied the timeline most closely. Because embedded within the succession files, beside the formal assessments and the constitutional advisor's recommendations, is a record of a private conversation between Charles and William that took place weeks before Windsor. A conversation in which the future king spoke clearly about what he believed the next reign required. A conversation that Charles later described, in the recorded account prepared for the archive, as the moment he understood that delay was no longer a responsible option. What William said in that room, and what it reveals about how much the prince already understood of what was being planned, may reframe everything that has been presented as Charles's decision alone. The private conversation between Charles and William that the succession files preserve is not described in full anywhere in the documents that have been reviewed. What is recorded is its outcome, the king's written acknowledgement that, following that exchange, he understood delay to be no longer responsible, and a single phrase attributed to the Prince of Wales that constitutional advisors later described as the clearest expression of the next generation's position they had encountered. William did not ask his father to act against Camilla. He did not request her removal. What he communicated, according to the archived account, was something more structural and, in some ways, more difficult to argue against. He told Charles that the next reign could not function beneath two competing centers of female authority, and that the longer the palace allowed that ambiguity to persist, the more damage it would do to Catherine's ability to begin her queenship with the credibility the institution required. That framing is important because it shifts the nature of William's intervention considerably. He was not, by this account, acting out of personal animosity or pursuing a private grievance. He was making an institutional argument, one that the evidence the palace had already gathered largely supported. And Charles, who had spent his own accession navigating the consequences of divided loyalty and competing advisory structures, was in a position to understand that argument with unusual clarity. Some royal analysts have suggested that William's choice to frame his concerns in institutional rather than personal terms was itself a signal of how seriously the future king had thought through the implications. It is considerably harder to dismiss an argument about the structural requirements of a functioning monarchy than it is to dismiss a family complaint. And it is considerably harder, once that argument has been made clearly and recorded formally, to continue treating inaction as a neutral option. What this reveals about the relationship between Charles and his son is something royal observers have found quietly significant. Because the version of events that circulated in the immediate aftermath of the instrument's signing, in which Charles acted unilaterally, motivated primarily by his own assessment of what the institution required, begins to look, under closer examination, like an incomplete account. Not an inaccurate one, necessarily, but one that omits a dynamic that the palace appears to have been careful not to emphasize. The sovereign signed the instrument. That much is beyond question. But the conditions that made signing it feel not just appropriate, but necessary had been shaped, at least in part, by a direct private conversation with the man who will eventually inherit everything the document is designed to protect. This raises a question that has not yet been fully answered. To what extent was the Crown Continuity Instrument the product of Charles's judgment, and to what extent was it a response to pressure, however respectfully and institutionally it was expressed, from the next generation? The distinction matters because it determines something important about where power inside the British monarchy currently resides. A sovereign who acts on his own analysis, informed by but not directed by his heir, is exercising authority in the way the constitutional position demands. A sovereign who formalizes in writing what his son has privately argued for, using the language and framework his son's position requires, is doing something subtly but meaningfully different. Royal commentators have been cautious about drawing that conclusion too directly. But several have noted that the timeline, the private conversation, followed weeks later by the instrument, invites the question, even if it does not definitively answer it. There is a historical dimension here that is worth considering carefully. The relationship between a reigning monarch and an heir who has waited a long time to inherit has never been a straightforward one, and the British monarchy has navigated its tensions with varying degrees of success across generations. What distinguishes the current situation from many historical parallels is the degree to which William has already, through public role and institutional presence, begun to function as a figure of independent authority. The Wales household is not simply a preparation for a future reign. It is, by any practical measure, already a parallel center of public engagement, charitable leadership, and strategic communication. That is not a criticism. It reflects the demands placed on the modern monarchy and the scale of work required to maintain its relevance. But it does mean that the relationship between Charles's reign and William's future one is closer, in structural terms, than the formal constitutional position might suggest. And it means that a document designed to smooth the transition between those two reigns is not simply planning for a distant future. It is managing a present reality that is already considerably more complex than the palace's public presentation has typically acknowledged. Against that backdrop, Camilla's position acquires a dimension that has rarely been explored openly. She was not simply caught between her husband's institutional priorities and his son's future requirements. She was caught between two phases of the monarchy that are, in some respects, already overlapping. Her influence was not being removed in anticipation of a transition that might lie years away. It was being removed in response to pressures that were already actively shaping the institution's direction. That is a meaningful difference, and it may explain why the instrument was drafted with a degree of permanence and structural reach that surprised even some of those involved in its preparation. This was not a holding measure. It was a settlement, one designed to resolve a tension that the palace had concluded could not be managed through informal arrangement or patient diplomacy any longer. What remains, genuinely unresolved, however, is the question of whether the instrument will achieve what it was designed to achieve. Because formal documents, however carefully worded, cannot fully govern the informal dynamics through which influence actually moves inside institutions. Senior advisors build relationships. Trusted individuals carry access that no clause can formally extinguish. And Camilla, whatever the instrument determines about her future authority, retains something that no constitutional framework can remove, the private ear of a king who loves her, for however long his reign continues. That private access, and what she chose to do with it in the days following the signing, may ultimately matter more to the story's outcome than anything written in the instrument itself. What Camilla chose to do with that private access in the days following the signing was not what many inside the palace had anticipated. Those who expected a sustained campaign, a determined effort to use her proximity to the king to quietly unpick what the instrument had established, found instead something more controlled, and in some respects more strategically sophisticated. She did not immediately press Charles for reversal. She did not mobilize her household or instruct her advisors to mount a formal challenge. What she did, according to accounts that have since filtered through palace-adjacent sources, was wait. And in the particular architecture of royal power, waiting is rarely passive. It is frequently the most deliberate choice available. The significance of that restraint became clearer when the leak emerged. Because the appearance of a photographed paragraph from the instrument in the hands of a national broadcaster did not occur in a vacuum, and the timing, arriving before the palace had made any public statement about the document's existence, told its own story. Security officers traced the photograph page to a copier associated with one of Camilla's senior household aides. The aide's explanation, offered during a recorded internal interview, was that the copy had been made solely to obtain independent legal advice. That explanation was not, on its face, implausible. Senior royal staff routinely seek legal counsel when documents of constitutional significance affect their employers' positions. But the timing of when that copy was made, and the circumstances under which it appears to have left the palace's control, have led some observers to suggest that the leak served a purpose beyond the merely administrative. The effect of that single leaked paragraph was immediate and significant. Within the palace, it forced a decision that had been carefully managed as a private institutional matter into the domain of public accountability. Communications officials found themselves drafting responses under acute time pressure, weighing the risks of denial against the risks of confirmation, and calculating whether the story could be shaped before the broader details emerged. Outside the palace, it transformed what had been an internal succession arrangement into a national conversation about two women, two versions of royal purpose, and the question of what the monarchy owed to each of them. And that conversation, once started, could not be managed by press office language alone. What the leak also did, and this is perhaps its most consequential effect, was remove the palace's ability to control the sequence in which information reached the public. Charles had signed the instrument with a specific narrative in mind, a deliberate, carefully considered succession framework presented at a moment of the palace's choosing, in language that protected Camilla's dignity while establishing Catherine's future authority. The leak destroyed that sequencing entirely. Instead of a managed announcement, the public received a fragment, 11 words, stripped of context, without the careful framing that would have surrounded a formal disclosure. And 11 words, presented without context, in a story involving two women and a king's signature, were always going to be interpreted through the lens of competition, loss, and selection rather than institutional planning. The palace's decision not to retreat, Charles's refusal to withdraw the instrument even when a draft denial was placed before him, is the moment that transformed this from a crisis into a defining act. Royal commentators have noted that a different sovereign, facing the combination of a private leak, a wounded queen consort, and a national broadcaster asking questions, might have chosen to buy time through ambiguity. Charles did not. His stated reasoning, preserved in the household record, was that retreat would render the future crown appear negotiable, that any visible hesitation in the face of public pressure would signal to every competing interest inside and outside the palace that the instrument's authority could be eroded. That reasoning is constitutionally coherent. It is also, some analysts have observed, the reasoning of a man who understood that this particular decision, once made and once partially exposed, could only be undermined by the person who made it. And he was not willing to be that person. But the decision to hold firm introduced its own pressure because it meant that Catherine now carried something she had not asked to carry publicly, the status of a woman whose elevation had been forced into view before she had the opportunity to define it herself. She had spent her royal life cultivating the impression that her influence was earned organically through service and character rather than through formal designation. The instrument, and the circumstances of its exposure, threatened to reframe her in terms she found uncomfortable, not as a future queen who had grown into the role through dedication, but as a figure whose position had been secured through a document that simultaneously diminished another woman. Her request, in the aftermath of the leak, to meet Camilla privately, without advisors, without secretaries, without husbands present, was not simply a personal gesture. It was a deliberate attempt to recover the human dimension of a story that institutional language had stripped of it. That meeting, in the small garden room at Clarence House, lasted long enough to change something that no document could have changed on its own. Catherine's opening words, that she had not come to take anything, were not diplomatic formality. They were, by several accounts, the sentence that shifted the atmosphere entirely because they addressed directly the interpretation Camilla had been carrying since she first read the instrument alone. The queen consort had read the document as a verdict on the value of everything she had endured. Catherine's presence in that room, and the honesty with which she spoke about her own fear rather than her own elevation, offered something the instrument could not, the possibility that what had been taken from Camilla was not a judgment of her worth, but a consequence of circumstances that had become structurally impossible to resolve any other way. Camilla's decision to hand Catherine a handwritten statement of acceptance before leaving that room may prove to be the most consequential act of this entire sequence, not because it altered the formal terms of the instrument, but because it removed the one outcome that could have made the instrument's implementation genuinely damaging to the institution. A queen consort who publicly contested the document, who allowed her private grief to become an active political opposition to the next reign, would have created a division within the monarchy that no succession framework, however carefully written, could have contained. Her restraint did not restore what she had lost, but it gave Charles something essential: the ability to present what had happened not as a family rupture, but as a considered transition, accepted by everyone it affected, and therefore capable of serving the purpose for which it had been designed. Whether the British public will ultimately interpret these events through the lens of institutional necessity or personal cost depends, to a considerable degree, on what the palace chooses to emphasize in the months ahead. Both interpretations are defensible. Both are, in different ways, true. A decision can be institutionally necessary and personally brutal simultaneously, and the British relationship with its monarchy has always been shaped by an ability to hold both of those realities in mind at once. What the country witnessed, in the days following the instrument's exposure, was not simply a palace managing a crisis. It was a monarchy navigating the oldest challenge in its history, the question of how power moves between generations without destroying the relationships and the trust on which the institution depends. Charles had answered that question with a signature. Catherine had answered it with a sentence in a garden room. Camilla had answered it with a handwritten note placed quietly in another woman's hands. And William, who had spoken the words that made delay impossible, who had signed the receipt confirming he understood what his father had done, who had stood beside Catherine as the country absorbed the news, had answered it with silence. The careful, deliberate silence of a man who understands that the reign now taking shape around him will be defined not by what he says in moments like this, but by what he has the patience to allow others to understand on their own. The crown continuity instrument will remain in the transition box, sealed, for as long as Charles reigns. When the moment eventually comes for it to be opened and acted upon, the people most affected by its contents will have had years to find their own accommodation with what it means. Whether that accommodation holds, whether the careful architecture Charles constructed survives the unpredictable pressures of an actual transition, is something no document can guarantee, and no family conversation can fully settle in advance. What do you think? Was this a necessary act of institutional courage from a king who understood what the monarchy required, or does a decision of this permanence, made at a moment of personal conflict, carry risks that only time will reveal? The comment section is open, and on a question this complex, every perspective matters.